They dragged an Apache woman across the saloon floor by her hair, and every man in that room looked away. Her name was Nita. She only came to trade flour and cloth, but Emmett Cole wanted blood, and he wanted the whole town watching. His hand tightened around her throat when the doors slammed open behind him. Nobody knew the stranger's name. By sundown, 3 men would be dead, and Cinder Rock would never be the same. Before we start, drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from today. And if frontier stories like this one keep you glued to the screen, hit that subscribe button so you never miss the next tale of justice on the old frontier. The sun was barely over the hills when Nita rode into Cinder Rock, same as she did every month. She came with 2 bags of dried herbs and soft deer hides, hoping to trade for flour, cloth, and a little salt for the winter ahead. The streets were quiet at that hour, just a few dogs barking and a wagon creaking somewhere down the road. She had made this trip so many times that she knew every crooked fence post and every squeaky porch step along the way. But something felt different that morning, though she couldn't say what it was. Maybe it was the way 2 men on the porch stopped talking the second she rode past them. Maybe it was the silence that followed her like a shadow. She pushed the feeling aside and kept riding toward the trading post, telling herself it was nothing. She was wrong. Inside the little store, old Mr. Higgins greeted her the same way he always did, with a tired smile and a nod toward the counter. He was a kind man, one of the few in town who still treated her fairly, but even he seemed uneasy that morning. His eyes kept drifting toward the front window, toward the street outside, like he was waiting for something bad to walk through that door. He counted her herbs quickly, almost too quickly, and packed her flour without the usual friendly chatter. Nita noticed his hands were shaking slightly as he tied the sack shut. She wanted to ask him what was wrong, but before she could say a word, loud laughter spilled in from the street outside, rough and mean, the kind of laughter that made good people go quiet. Emmett Cole came stumbling out of the saloon across the street with 2 of his father's ranch hands close behind him, all 3 of them already drunk, though it wasn't even noon. Emmett was the kind of young man who had never once been told no in his entire life, and it showed in the way he walked, like the whole street belonged to him. He was loud, restless, and looking for trouble the way some men look for a good meal. When his eyes landed on Nita through the store window, something ugly crossed his face, and he smiled the way a man smiles right before he does something cruel. He crossed the street with his 2 friends trailing behind him, and before Nita even understood what was happening, his hand closed hard around her wrist, pulling her out through the door and into the open street. He shouted for the whole town to hear, calling her people raiders, calling her a thief, saying words that weren't even true, just cruel things meant to hurt her in front of everyone watching. Doors opened slightly along the street as people peeked out to see the commotion, but not one of them stepped outside. Farmers at the little cafe table looked down at their plates like the food had suddenly become very interesting. The bartender across the street picked up a glass and wiped it clean, then wiped it again, though it had been clean the whole time. Nobody said a word. Nobody moved to help her. It was as if the whole town had decided, without speaking it out loud, that her pain simply wasn't their business. Nita didn't cry out. She kept her back straight and her eyes steady on Emmett, even as his grip tightened around her wrist, hard enough to leave a mark. She had learned long ago that showing fear only made men like him hungrier for more. But deep inside, her heart was pounding, because she knew exactly how these moments could end for someone like her. Alone, outnumbered, and surrounded by people too scared to help. Just as Emmett raised his voice again, ready to drag her further into the street for the whole town to see, the saloon doors behind him creaked open, slow and heavy, the sound cutting straight through the noise like a warning bell. A stranger stepped out onto the porch, dust still clinging to his long coat from what looked like days on the trail. He didn't rush, he didn't shout. He simply stood there for a moment, studying the scene in front of him, with quiet, careful eyes. The kind of eyes that had clearly seen far worse than one drunk rancher's son making a scene. Then he walked down the steps and crossed the street at an easy pace, like he had all the time in the world, though every step brought him closer to Emmett and the woman he was holding by the wrist. He didn't reach for the gun at his hip. He didn't need to. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and calm, almost gentle, but it carried across that silent street like a shot in an empty canyon. He told Emmett to let go of her arm before he embarrassed himself in front of the whole town. For a second, Emmett just laughed, the kind of laugh a man makes when he's trying to sound braver than he feels. He asked the stranger who he thought he was, walking into Cinder Rock and telling a Cole what to do on his own street. But something in the stranger's stillness made that laugh die out fast. The two ranch hands behind Emmett shifted uneasily, glancing at each other like neither one wanted to be the first to make a move. The street had gone so quiet that you could hear the wind pushing dust along the boards. Emmett's grip on Nita's wrist loosened, then let go completely. He shoved past the stranger's shoulder as he stormed off, muttering that this wasn't over, that he'd remember this. Nita rubbed her wrist and turned to thank the man who had just stepped between her and a mob of angry drunks, expecting him to nod, climb back on his horse, and ride on out of town like every other stranger who never wanted trouble. But he didn't move toward his horse at all. He just stood there in the street, watching the direction Emmett had gone, like a man who already knew this wasn't finished either. Jack didn't ride out of Cinder Rock that afternoon, though every instinct from years on the trail told him he should. Something about the silence in that street kept pulling at him, the way nobody had moved, the way grown men had looked down at their plates instead of standing up for a woman being dragged through the dirt. He wanted to understand why. So instead of leaving, he walked the length of town, stopping at the cafe, the livery, the little church on the corner, asking quiet questions and getting nothing but nervous shrugs and closed doors in return. It wasn't until he sat down across from an old widow named Sarah, who ran the boarding house at the end of the street, that he finally got an honest answer. She poured him a cup of coffee, glanced toward the window twice, and told him the truth in a low voice, like the walls themselves might be listening. The Cole family didn't just own the biggest ranch in the county, they owned every well within 20 miles. Cross them, even once, and your family would be hauling water from a dry creek bed by winter. That single sentence explained everything Jack had seen that morning, and it sat heavy in his chest for the rest of the day. He found Nita finishing up at the trading post not long after, and without a word, he simply fell into step a few paces behind her, walking her back through town so she could finish her business in peace. He didn't hover close enough to make her uneasy, but he watched every window, every doorway, every shadow that moved along the porches, the way a man does when he's spent years expecting trouble to come from the quiet corners rather than the loud ones. Nita noticed, though she said nothing about it. She wasn't used to anyone watching her back, and she wasn't sure yet what to make of a stranger who asked for nothing in return. By the time she loaded her goods and rode out toward the hills, Jack had already decided he wasn't leaving town. Not yet, not until he understood exactly what kind of storm was building behind Emmett Cole's bruised pride. That night, sleep wouldn't come easy for Jack. He lay in the small room above the saloon, staring at the ceiling, listening to the wind rattle the shutters, and his mind kept dragging him back to a place he'd spent years trying to bury. Years ago, he had worn a different uniform and answered to a different name in Army reports, riding as a scout for a cavalry unit sent deep into Apache territory. One cold morning, his commanding officer gave an order to burn a village to the ground, women and children included, all in the name of clearing land for settlers who hadn't even arrived yet. Jack refused. He rode ahead instead and warned the families, helping dozens of them slip into the hills before the soldiers ever reached the camp. By sunrise, he was branded a deserter and a traitor to his own uniform, a wanted man in every fort from there to the border. He had been drifting ever since, town to town, job to job, never staying long enough for anyone to ask the kind of questions that could get a man hanged. Lying there in the dark, he realized that Nita's village might not be so different from the one he had once tried to save, and that thought alone kept him awake until the first gray light of morning. He rose early, restless, and walked toward the stable to check on his horse before the town fully woke. That was when he heard the voices, low and careless, coming from behind the stalls, two of Emmett's ranch hands talking like nobody in the world was listening. Jack stayed still in the shadow of the barn door, and what he heard made his blood run cold. They weren't just talking about roughing up Nita again to settle Emmett's wounded pride. They were talking about staging something bigger, making it look like Apache raiders had struck a homestead, burning a barn, maybe worse, just enough to convince Old Man Cole's friends in the territory office to call the army back into these hills. Jack understood in an instant that this had never been about one drunk young man's temper. Emmett was being used, or maybe he was the one doing the using, to hand his father exactly the excuse he needed to push every Apache family off land the Cole ranch had wanted for years. Jack left the stable without a sound, his mind racing through everything Sarah had told him about the wells, everything he had heard about Cole's grip on this town, and everything he already knew from his own past about how fast a lie like that could turn into a massacre. He had to find Nita before she rode any further from town, because whatever was coming wasn't going to stop with her bruised wrist and wounded pride. This was bigger, and it was moving fast. He caught up to her just as she was tightening the last strap on her saddle at the edge of town, ready to head back toward her people. Jack didn't waste time with pleasantries. He told her plainly what he had overheard in the stable, watching her face carefully as the words landed, waiting to see if she would dismiss him the way so many others in this territory had learned to dismiss warnings from strangers. She didn't. Her eyes went sharp and distant for a moment, like she was already running through every possible danger to her camp, to her people, to her son waiting for her back home. She told Jack she couldn't stay in Cinder Rock one more hour, that she had to reach her elders before Cole's men could put their plan into motion, before soldiers came riding into a peaceful camp expecting to find raiders instead of families. Jack looked at her for a long moment, and something settled in him then. Quiet and certain, the same kind of certainty he had felt the night he chose to warn a village instead of following orders. If you've ever had someone judge you before they even knew your story, drop a comment below and tell us about it, because sometimes the most dangerous thing in a town isn't the man with the gun, it's the whole crowd that decided who to fear before they ever asked why. Nita turned her horse toward the hills, and Jack stood there in the settling dust, watching her go, already knowing in his gut that riding away now wasn't an option anymore. Somewhere out past those ridges, a storm was building that neither one of them was ready for, and it was coming faster than either of them thought. Jack rode back into Cinder Rock that same afternoon, his mind made up before his boots even hit the ground. He found Nita waiting near the edge of town, and together they agreed on the only plan that made any sense. If Cole was planning to fake an attack and pull the army into these hills, then the real army post 20 miles east needed to hear the truth first, straight from someone they might actually believe. A warning sent early enough could stop soldiers from ever riding out at all. The trouble was neither of them could risk making that ride alone without drawing eyes, so they turned to the one man in town who wore a badge and was supposed to stand for the law above everything else. Sheriff Dawes listened carefully when they laid it all out in his office, nodding along, asking the right questions, even offering to write out the message himself and carry it to the post under cover of darkness so nobody would suspect a thing. He seemed like exactly the kind of man this town desperately needed, calm, steady in his words, willing to risk something for once instead of looking away. Nita felt a small flicker of hope for the first time since Emmett had grabbed her wrist in the street. Jack wanted to believe it too, but some old habit from his scouting days kept a small knot of doubt sitting in his chest, a feeling he couldn't quite explain even to himself. He decided to ride out alongside the sheriff anyway, just to make sure the message actually left town. That night, the trail east was dark and quiet, lit only by a thin sliver of moon cutting through the pines. Jack rode a little ahead, senses sharp, listening to every snap of a branch and every shift in the wind. He never saw the first shot coming. The bullet tore through his shoulder before the sound of the rifle even reached his ears, knocking him sideways off his horse and into the cold dirt. Pain exploded through his whole side as he rolled toward the brush, drawing his own gun on instinct, firing blind into the darkness at whoever had been waiting for him. Whoever it was didn't stay to finish the job, melting back into the trees the same way they'd appeared, leaving Jack alone in the dark, bleeding, and painfully aware of one simple fact. Nobody in this territory should have known which trail he'd be riding that night, not unless someone had told them exactly where to wait. He dragged himself back onto his horse through sheer stubbornness, pressing a torn piece of his shirt hard against the wound, and somehow made it back to the edge of town just before sunrise. He found Sheriff Dawes' office empty, the message he'd supposedly ridden out to deliver still sitting folded on the desk, never sent at all. That was when the full weight of it settled over him. The sheriff had never planned to help them. He'd simply needed to know exactly where Jack would be, long enough to pass that information straight to Cole, and then step back and let someone else pull the trigger. The one man in Cinder Rock wearing a badge had been working for Barnaby Cole's family the entire time, and Jack had ridden straight into it with his eyes half open. Too wounded to sit a horse for another long ride, and with no one left in town he could trust with a badge or a title, Jack knew the warning to the army post now depended on someone else entirely. Nita thought hard about every face she'd seen in Cinder Rock, every person who had looked away in that street, until one name settled in her mind. The blacksmith, a broad, quiet man named Ezra, had never once looked away from her, not that day, not any day she'd passed through town. Years ago, the Cole family had forced his own brother off a small piece of land through the same kind of fake paperwork Nita had heard whispered about, and the man had buried that brother not long after, his health broken by the loss of everything he'd worked for. Nita found Ezra at his forge before the sun was fully up and told him everything, watching his jaw tighten with every word. Ezra didn't hesitate long. He led them both quietly into the back of his workshop, clearing a hidden space behind stacks of iron and old wagon wheels where Jack could lie down, and Nita could tend his wound with what little she had. Then Ezra saddled his own horse in the gray light before dawn, telling them plainly that he intended to ride for the army post himself, no matter what it cost him. He knew the trails better than most, having hauled iron out to the fort more than once, and he was willing to risk everything to make sure this message actually arrived this time. But even he couldn't promise how fast he could ride, or whether Cole's men were already watching every road leading out of Cinder Rock. All Jack and Nita could do now was wait through the night in that cramped, dark workshop, listening to every sound outside, not knowing if help would arrive in time, or if it would arrive at all. While they waited, hidden and helpless, Emmett Cole was gathering his father's ranch hands in the street outside, his face lit orange by torchlight, giving orders in a voice thick with whiskey and rage over his own humiliation. He wanted Higgins' store burned before sunrise, wanted the flames high enough for the whole territory to see, and wanted it made to look exactly like an Apache raid, complete with markings and signs his father's friends in the territory office would recognize instantly. It was no longer about one bruised wrist or one embarrassing afternoon in the street. Emmett wanted blood on the record, proof that would justify calling every soldier in the region down on Nita's people before anyone had the chance to ask a single honest question. Inside Ezra's workshop, Jack lay still, with his jaw clenched against the pane, listening to the faint sound of shouting drifting through the walls from somewhere out in the dark street. And he understood with sick certainty that whatever Cole was planning, it wasn't going to wait for daylight. The first light of morning hadn't even fully broken over Cinder Rock when the sound of boots on the street pulled Jack out of a shallow, pain-filled sleep. Through a crack in Ezra's workshop wall, he saw them coming, Emmett Cole at the front with a torch still smoking in his hand, a dozen ranch hands behind him carrying rifles and rope, marching straight toward Higgins' store like men who had already decided how this morning would end. There was no more time to wait for word from the army post, no more time to hope Ezra had made it through the night. Jack pushed himself up off the workshop floor, his shoulders screaming with every movement, and Nita grabbed his arm to stop him, telling him he was in no condition to stand, let alone face armed men in the open street. He looked at her for a long moment, then told her the truth plainly. If nobody stepped between Cole and that store right now, there wouldn't be a town left to save, and there wouldn't be an army post left to warn in time either. He walked out into the street alone, blood already soaking through the bandage Nita had wrapped around his shoulder, and planted himself directly between Emmett Cole's men and the front door of Higgins' store. Emmett stopped short, surprised to see the stranger still standing after what should have finished him on that trail the night before. Jack didn't reach for his gun. He simply stood there, pale and unsteady but unwilling to move, telling Emmett in a low, worn voice that everyone in that street already knew what he was planning to do, and that burning an innocent man's store to blame it on people who had done nothing wouldn't make him his father's equal, it would only make him a murderer. Emmett's face twisted with fury, and he raised his hand to signal his men forward, rifles lifting all along the street, aimed at one wounded man standing alone in the dust. For one terrible second, it looked like nothing was going to stop what came next. Then the ground itself seemed to shake as the sound of hooves came thundering down the road into town, fast and hard, more than one horse, more than a handful. Every head in that street turned at once to see Ezra riding in at full speed, and beside him, in a crisp blue coat that caught the early light, rode a real army officer with a small unit of soldiers close behind. The officer didn't slow down until he was right in the middle of the street, right between Cole's men and Jack, and when he spoke, his voice carried the kind of authority that made even Emmett's rifle waver in his hands. He held up a folded letter, signed and witnessed, taken from one of Cole's own ranch hands who had turned on his boss the moment soldiers showed up asking hard questions, desperate to save his own neck rather than hang for another man's scheme. The officer read enough of that letter out loud for the whole street to hear, every detail of Cole's plan laid bare in front of the very people who had once looked away and said nothing. The silence that followed was different from the silence in that saloon days before. This time it wasn't fear holding the townsfolk still, it was shame, thick and heavy, settling over faces that had watched a woman get dragged through the dirt and done nothing to stop it. One by one, doors that had stayed shut for years finally opened. Farmers stepped off their porches. The bartender came out from behind his bar. Old Sarah walked down from her boarding house steps, standing tall beside Jack in the street, and slowly, quietly, the whole town turned its back on Emmett Cole, and stood instead beside the wounded stranger, who had refused to look away. Emmett's rifle dropped from his shaking hands into the dirt, and his ranch hands, seeing soldiers now filling the street and their own boss's crimes laid bare in writing, lowered their weapons one after another until not a single gun was left raised. The soldiers moved in and placed Emmett under arrest right there in the same street where he had once grabbed Nita's wrist and called her people murderers in front of everyone. Word reached the officer soon after about Sheriff Dawes as well, and by mid-morning he too was stripped of his badge and led away in chains, his quiet betrayal finally dragged into the light where the whole town could see exactly what kind of man had been wearing that star all along. For the first time in longer than anyone in Cinder Rock could remember, justice hadn't come from fear or silence. It had come because one person refused to stay quiet, and because enough others finally found the courage to stand beside him. By afternoon, with the danger finally broken, and the truth laid out for every soldier and townsfolk to see, Nita knew it was time to ride home. Her son and her people had been waiting through a long, uncertain night, not knowing if soldiers were coming to burn their camp, or if the warning had reached anyone at all in time. She thanked Ezra, thanked Sarah, and turned to Jack, expecting once again that this was where their paths would finally split, the same way every other stranger's path had split from hers before. But Jack didn't hang back this time. Wounded, tired, and still healing, he climbed onto his horse beside her anyway, telling her simply that he wasn't finished walking her home yet. They rode out of Cinder Rock together, past the ridges and the pines, back toward the hills where her people waited, and for the first time in 20 years of drifting from town to town with nowhere that ever felt like his, Jack Hollis finally understood what it meant to ride toward somewhere instead of running away from everywhere. If this story moved you even a little, if it reminded you that one person standing up can change everything, then do something for us before you go. Subscribe, not just for the next story, but for every person out there who's ever felt like Nita did that morning, alone in a crowd that looked away. Somebody, somewhere, is waiting for one person brave enough to walk through those doors for them too. Be that person, and don't miss what we bring you next.